Alexander Pichushkin, also known as the chessboard killer, started his journey into rule-breaking human behavior when he was just a kid in Moscow. He took a hit to the head that altered his personality, turning him into a ticking time bomb instead of just another quiet kid with a love for chess. By his teens, he was obsessed with outsmarting everyone, which wasn't limited to board games. His big claim to infamy was when he decided that filling every square of a chessboard with a murder was a better hobby than stamp collecting. Like the worst kind of overachiever, he planned on racking up 64 victims, one for each square. But unlike your average criminal who tries to keep a low profile, this guy practically waved his personal playbook around. By the 1990s, Pichushkin was getting creative. He targeted vulnerable people, mostly elderly men and women around Moscow's parks, particularly Gypsy Park, because nothing says prime serial killer territory like a nice forested area. He lured victims with the most Russian method imaginable, vodka. Then he bashed their heads in with a blunt object or tossed them into a sewer. Sometimes, he'd even record his crimes, because who needs plausible deniability when you're building your own highlight reel? The cops? Amateurs in his eyes? The victims? Just pawns on his personal chessboard. His arrogance didn't stop there. He even claimed that murder was like love, but instead of butterflies, he got adrenaline. My guy, it sounds like Tinder would have saved a few lives. By the early 2000s, his tally was rising, and the sheer brazenness of his crimes was off the charts. He avoided patterns that would make profiling easy, mixing up his methods and targets. But he made one blunder. When one of his colleagues at work went missing, and he was literally the last person seen with them, Pichushkin still walked around like the rules of cause and effect didn't apply to him. He even left a trail of evidence that practically screamed, "Hey, it's me!" But the cops either didn't care or weren't paying attention. Either way, this guy broke the rules of basic criminal self-preservation because his ego had its own zip code by this point. His downfall came in 2006 when he got careless with Marina Moskolyova, one of the women he lured to Gypsy Park. She told her son who she was meeting, and her body was found shortly after. This time, investigators actually did their jobs, which is probably the only reason Pichushkin isn't still out there. His apartment was a goldmine of evidence, including his infamous chessboard. On it, he'd marked 61 of the 64 squares, claiming those were the murders he'd successfully carried out. He also admitted to wanting to surpass Andrei Chikatilo, another infamous Russian serial killer, like it was some sort of Olympic sport. During his trial, he showed no remorse, only frustration that he hadn't hit his target number. In 2007, Pichushkin was sentenced to life in prison, where he now gets to sit and think about his legacy as Russia's most arrogant killer. Oskar Schindler. What, you think it's just gonna be psychos? The human behavior is multifaceted. You know? Oskar Schindler started out as a German businessman who looked more like someone trying to cash in on World War II than save lives. In 1939, he joined the Nazi Party. Not hero material so far. He set up a factory in Krakow, Poland, to produce enamelware, pots and pans. He saw cheap labor in Jewish prisoners, and that's all he cared about at first. Schindler looked like the classic opportunist. Make money, stay close to power, rinse, repeat. Boost somewhere between counting profits and schmoozing Nazi officials, the man's moral compass woke up and chose violence against genocide. He started bribing SS officers to keep his Jewish workers alive, using his factory as a front to protect them from certain death. By 1942, when the Nazis ramped up deportations to death camps, Schindler was playing a game of high-stakes poker with human lives. He turned his factory into a protected workplace, convincing the Nazis that his Jewish workers were essential to the war effort. In reality, his factory was barely producing anything useful. He faked reports, smuggled supplies, and paid off Nazi officials. The craziest move came in 1944, when the Nazis shut down Krakow's ghetto and sent everyone to death camps. Schindler pulled off a stunt that makes most action heroes look lazy. He created a list of 1,200 Jewish workers and had them transferred to his new factory in Brunlitz, Czechoslovakia. And then this movie was made. By the time the war ended in 1945, Schindler was broke, a fugitive, and pretty much useless to the Nazis. But he had saved more than 1,000 Jewish lives, all because this slick businessman decided genocide wasn't great for business after all. After the war, he was no hero in Germany. He was just a guy who lost his money and his status. The people he saved, though, they never forgot. Those 1,200 people grew into generations of survivors. Felix Baumgartner. The natural human instinct is to avoid danger, unless you're Felix. Felix had the kind of childhood where jumping off high places sounded like a good idea. By the time he hit adulthood, Felix had turned jumping into a profession, working as a skydiver and base jumper. If regular thrill-seeking wasn't enough, he made a name for himself with stunts like leaping from the Petronas Towers in Malaysia, but none of that insanity compared to what he started cooking up in 2005 with the Red Bull Stratos project. In October 2012, after years of planning, Felix climbed into a pressurized capsule attached to a helium balloon. The guy had NASA-level tech backing him up. His target was the stratosphere, specifically 128,100 feet above Earth. If you're wondering why anyone would volunteer for this, the answer is probably a mix of ego and the fact that Felix might have watched Star Wars 1 too many times. At that altitude, he had to survive temperatures below -51°C, a lack of oxygen, and the risk of going into an uncontrollable spin that could scramble his brain like an egg. The jump itself was as ridiculous as it sounds. Felix stood on a platform the size of a dinner plate, 24 miles above Earth, and just jumped. Within seconds, he was falling at more than 1,300 kilometers an hour. That's a tad bit more than Mach 1. The pressure suit kept him alive, but for a terrifying few moments, he spun out of control and his body went ragdoll in the air. Somehow, he managed to stabilize and continued his descent. The freefall lasted 4 minutes and 19 seconds. After that, Felix deployed his parachute and glided to the New Mexico desert. Ground control, watching from below, probably aged 10 years in those few minutes. The science behind the jump was so that engineers could collect data that helped improve spacesuits and safety measures for astronauts. For Felix, though, it was a mission to be put in the history books. Well, it goes without saying that he did it. Jonestown. Everything in this started with this guy. This was Jim Jones. Jimmy was a preacher who somehow managed to mix socialism, religion, and his own God complex into one toxic cocktail. The People's Temple, his cult, began in the 1950s in Indianapolis, promising racial equality and community service. Sounds harmless, right? Nope. My guy was secretly obsessed with power and control. Kinda like this guy, but in the 70s. If you don't know who this guy is, bless your soul, but please find it on Ray William Johnson's channel after this. Anyway, Jimmy was like if every motivational speaker got their own private army. By the 1970s, Jones relocated his followers to California and started preparing for his ultimate dream, a utopian society where he ruled everything. In public, he played the role of a benevolent leader. In private, he demanded absolute loyalty, faked miracles, and built a paranoia machine convincing people the world was out to get them. Think of it as the American Horror Story version of community service. In the mid-70s, Jones decided California wasn't paranoid enough for him and moved his operation to a jungle in Guyana, calling it Jonestown. There, he promised his followers heaven on earth. Well, it was a jungle. So if your definition of heaven is mosquito bites and bacteria that you can't even pronounce going in your body, bon appetit. The settlement was isolated, overcrowded, and heavily monitored by armed guards. Jones controlled every aspect of life, what people ate, who they talked to, even when they slept. If 1984 was a cult and not a novel, this would be it. Members worked long hours, listened to Jones's endless rants over a loudspeaker, and lived in constant fear of punishment, which included public shaming and beatings. You know it's bad when the jungle itself is like, dang, these conditions suck. By 1978, the cracks in Jones's delusion started to show. Reports of abuse, financial manipulation, and people being held against their will reached U.S. officials. Then this guy showed up. He's Congressman Leo Ryan. He started to investigate Jonestown after hearing from worried family members. Ryan and his delegation arrived in November 1978, and at first, Jones tried to play it cool, as if the armed guards and malnourished cultists were just quirks of the community. But then, a few members asked Ryan to help them escape. Jones lost it faster than LeBron James not getting a foul called. As Ryan's group prepared to leave, Jones sent his goons to ambush them at the airstrip. That sent Ryan to Jimmy's heaven, plus 4 others. After the murders, Jones convinced his followers that they had no choice but to commit a revolutionary S-word to avoid getting captured. And yes, this was all framed as some noble act, because apparently nothing says utopia like drinking cyanide-laced Kool-Aid. Over 900 people died that day. Men, women, children, no one was left behind in what became the largest loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until the 2 towers in New York got the "here comes the airplane" treatment. Jim Jones never had love, self-preservation, and empathy. He broke people so completely that they willingly, or in some cases, forcibly followed him to their deaths. Genain quadruplets. The Genain quadruplets were 4 identical sisters born in the 1930s in Iowa who all developed schizophrenia, a rare statistical nightmare for their genetic pool. They were named Nora, Iris, Myra, and Hester. Not their real names for privacy reasons, of course. They grew up in a household that was less Leave It to Beaver and more psychological experiment gone wrong. Their father, a controlling figure who might as well have been auditioning for the role of villain in a 1950s PSA, ran the house with strict, suffocating rules. Meanwhile, their mother was described as submissive and inconsistent in her parenting. From a young age, all four girls started showing signs of developmental delays. They were slow to talk, didn't socialize much, and generally had a tough time meeting those milestones that every overly competitive parent brags about at dinner parties. By their teenage years, things escalated. Nora, the eldest, began experiencing delusions and paranoia. The other three weren't far behind. Researchers were baffled because identical quadruplets sharing this condition is rarer than finding someone who genuinely enjoys small talk. The scientific community got wind of this genetic jackpot, and the sisters became the focus of intense study. They were poked, prodded, and analyzed as researchers tried to study how one family could have 4 children that shared the same mental health condition. The researchers' conclusion? Schizophrenia has both genetic and environmental triggers. Groundbreaking stuff. Anyway, their father's paranoia about the girls' purity didn't help. He reportedly forced them to perform hymen checks. Yep, hymen checks. He also stopped them from having any sort of adolescent development. If Freud had been around, he would have had a field day with this guy. As adults, the Genain sisters struggled to maintain independence. Their symptoms varied. Some had auditory hallucinations, others delusional thinking, and a couple dealt with debilitating apathy. Their condition made holding jobs or forming relationships next to impossible. The 4 lived in and out of institutions. While their cases provided a treasure chest of data for researchers, the sisters themselves continued life defined by their illness. Imagine being known not for who you are, but for the scientific papers written about your brain. What made their situation even more unusual was the debate about the environment they were raised in. Some researchers suggested that their father's controlling and abusive tendencies acted as a catalyst for their illnesses, while others leaned on genetics as the primary culprit. It's the age-old nature versus nurture debate. Charles Cullen. Charles Cullen started his career as a nurse in 1986 at St. Barnabas Medical Center in New Jersey. From the jump, he was a walking red flag. Cullen tampered with IV bags, sneaking insulin or dujoxin into them, killing his first known victim, a judge recovering from a routine procedure. His brain, by the way, had already punched its ticket to Psychotown. This was a guy killing random patients for the hell of it. After some suspicious deaths and medical supplies randomly going missing, St. Barnabas fired him. Of course, instead of reporting him to authorities, they just let him bounce to another hospital. Cullen walked off scot-free like he was switching jobs at Walmart. Next stop, Warren Hospital. The dude was there less than 2 years and managed to kill 3 more patients by overdosing them with dujoxin. One patient literally woke up while he was injecting her with something, and when she reported it, the hospital did nothing. Nothing. You could argue Cullen was bad at human behavior, but Warren Hospital, they were on a speed run to win Worst Employer of the Year. Cullen dipped again, heading to Hunterdon Medical Center in 1994, where the bodies kept piling up. But the hospitals? They just quietly pushed him along like dirty laundry. By 1998, Cullen hit Morristown Memorial Hospital, and shocker, people started dying from unexplained overdoses. If you think hospitals were catching on by now, you'd be wrong. They shrugged their shoulders, probably stamped oops on a few files, and Cullen landed another gig at Somerset Medical Center in 2002. Here's where it gets insane. The guy started getting sloppy. Nurses noticed insulin bottles going missing and patient charts looking suspicious. One doctor straight up said, "Yeah, this dude is killing people," and notified Somerset's higher-ups. Instead of immediately calling the police, the hospital sat on it for months because reporting suspicious activity is, apparently, way too much effort. Cullen killed at least 13 more patients before finally getting caught in December 2003. When investigators put the pieces together, the scale of Cullen's insanity became clear. He worked at 9 different hospitals over 16 years, and hospitals repeatedly covered up his tracks to avoid bad PR. Cullen admitted to killing at least 29 people, but experts believe the number is closer to 400. The guy killed people who weren't even close to dying. He wasn't putting suffering patients out of their misery. He was injecting lethal doses into people recovering from surgery or fighting off minor infections. His whole MO was to be unreasonably irrational. No clear motive, no anger, no remorse. Cullen didn't even pick victims based on any pattern. He killed anyone whenever he felt like it. It was chaos for chaos's sake, with medical staff casually standing by like it was none of their business. Cullen got 18 consecutive life sentences in 2006, so he'll rot behind bars for the rest of his life. Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was born into slavery in Maryland around 1822. Early on, she got a taste of what her life was supposed to look like. backbreaking labor, beatings, and zero human rights. By her mid-teens, she had already suffered a traumatic brain injury from being hit in the head with a heavy metal weight thrown by an overseer. Fun fact, this injury caused seizures and vivid dreams for the rest of her life, which she claimed were visions from God. A total Joan of Arc moment. Her response from this was escaping in 1849. Most enslaved people who managed to escape didn't come back for anyone else. Harriet? Oh no, she turned around like she was in a one-woman sequel to Mission Impossible. By the 1850s, Harriet became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, leading groups of enslaved people to freedom. She risked her life every single time, traveling at night through swamps and forests, dodging bounty hunters and their bloodhounds. At least 13 trips and 70 people later, Harriet had a bounty on her head that would make Dog the bounty hunter drool. Southern slaveholders hated her so much they called her Moses, but she wasn't splitting seas. She was splitting slave owners' bank accounts by taking their unpaid laborers. And just to rub salt in the wound, she carried a pistol, partly to protect her group, partly to encourage the more nervous escapees. Yeah, Harriet Tubman wasn't asking twice if someone got cold feet. During the Civil War, she worked for the Union Army as a spy, scout, and nurse because just freeing people wasn't enough. Her crowning achievement? The Combahee River Raid in 1863. Harriet led a Union gunboat raid in South Carolina, freeing over 700 enslaved people in one go. After the war, Tubman settled in Auburn, New York, but no retirements of gardening and knitting yet. She opened her home to anyone in need, whether they were formerly enslaved people, family members, or just some humans who hit rock bottom. She also fought for women's voting rights, teaming up with people like Susan B. Anthony. Honestly, at this point, Harriet Tubman was like the Beyoncé of human rights, unstoppable, iconic, and probably tired as hell. Oh, and she lived into her 90s, which, considering the healthcare in the 19th century, is basically like surviving in the Hunger Games for decades. Reinhold Messner, born in 1944 in South Tyrol, Italy, and grew up in the Dolomite Mountains. By the time he was a teenager, he had climbed more peaks than most people have excuses to avoid cardio. In 1970, he and his brother Gunther attempted Nanga Parbat, a deadly mountain in Pakistan. They summited but didn't exactly come down the same way. Gunther died in an avalanche, and Reinhold lost 7 toes to frostbite. Reinhold learned his lesson in that event, and the lesson was to keep climbing apparently. This guy was built like an RPG character with a 99 stamina stat. Instead of quitting, he doubled down and went on to climb multiple peaks solo with no oxygen tanks. By 1978, Reinhold and his climbing buddy Peter Habeler decided to climb Mount Everest without supplemental oxygen, something no human had ever survived. The logic here was non-existent. Everyone else used oxygen tanks because the air above 8,000 meters is so thin it's called the death zone. Messner and Habeler, though, they just hiked up like they were on a casual stroll through Mordor. It worked. They reached the summit, proving that lungs aren't a strict requirement for survival if you're stubborn enough. Of course, everyone thought this was insane, but Messner responded by climbing Everest alone and without oxygen in 1980, because if you're going to break the rules of human behavior, you might as well do it twice. The 1980 solo climb was peak Messner. He skipped everything that makes climbing Everest remotely reasonable. No Sherpa team, no backup, just him, some gear, and a death wish. It took 3 days of brutal climbing, with snowstorms and winds that could knock over a small house. But Messner reached the top. No one else had done anything like it before or since. The guy walked through conditions that kill seasoned climbers and made it look like he was out for groceries. By the way, during this climb, he also battled hallucinations caused by the lack of oxygen, making it less a mountaineering feat and more a real-life boss fight. Over his career, he climbed all 14 of the world's peaks over 8,000 meters, becoming the first person to do so without supplemental oxygen. And he wasn't just climbing mountains. He crossed deserts and Antarctica too. His ability to survive these extremes made scientists question if he was even human. Most people plan vacations to avoid stress. Messner's vacations were stress. He made his life harder on purpose just to flex. Tanganyika laughter. In 1962, a strange series of events started in a small village called Kashasha in Tanganyika, today's Tanzania. A group of schoolgirls at a mission-run school began laughing uncontrollably. Within hours, dozens of girls were affected, and teachers couldn't get them to stop. School had to shut down after a few weeks because trying to teach algebra to kids who were basically doing their best Joker impersonation wasn't working. The laughter wasn't fun for them either. It came with crying, fainting, and even physical pain, which kind of kills the vibe. After the school closed, the laughter epidemic didn't stay put. It spread to nearby villages. Families of the girls started laughing, and soon neighbors joined in. It reached another school, where over 200 students caught the laughing bug. Scientists and doctors showed up, probably looking like they just walked into a Monty Python sketch. But they were baffled. No one had a clue what was happening. There were no signs of toxins, no weird gases, and absolutely no TikTok challenges to blame it on. Over 6 months, it affected an estimated 1,000 people in different villages, mostly kids and teenagers. Symptoms weren't limited to just laughter, though. People complained of anxiety, restlessness, and difficulty breathing. If someone started laughing in public, others nearby were at risk of catching it too, which is the most awkward way to be contagious. Adults were mostly spared, so naturally, some blamed witchcraft because when in doubt, witch it out. Others thought it was stress from the country's recent independence, which might sound like a stretch, but history has worse theories. Experts labeled it a case of mass psychogenic illness, where stress and fear cause physical symptoms in groups. The laughter epidemic broke all kinds of rules about how humans should behave because it spread like an actual disease, except there was no virus, no bacteria. It showed how people could be so tightly connected emotionally that their brains practically synced up in chaos mode. Also, the fact that no one really got answers makes it feel less like science. D.D. Blanchard. Munchausen by proxy is when someone, usually a caregiver, pretends someone they're taking care of is sick, or even makes them sick, to get attention or sympathy. It's bad enough that people do this. Dee Dee claimed her daughter, Gypsy Rose, had everything from leukemia to muscular dystrophy to a mental age of 7. Meanwhile, Gypsy was healthy, walking around in secret and getting fed mashed up meds. Dee Dee started her fake medical drama back when Gypsy was a baby. She told doctors that Gypsy had sleep apnea. No evidence? No problem. She just kept piling on the lies. Over the years, she diagnosed Gypsy with epilepsy, hearing and vision problems, and a shopping list of other conditions. And if a doctor pushed back, Dee Dee just ghosted them and moved on to the next one. Gypsy's childhood was a total circus of wheelchairs, feeding tubes, and charity events. Dee Dee shaved Gypsy's head and told her she'd never grow hair because of the cancer she didn't actually have. They even moved into a house built by Habitat for Humanity, complete with a wheelchair ramp. Dee Dee milked everyone's sympathy dry, showing up at fundraisers and even Disney trips. Nothing says tragic family like a free vacation to see Mickey Mouse. When Gypsy hit her teens, she started figuring out something was seriously off. Like, she could walk. Secretly, she started using the internet to connect with people outside her mom's twisted reality. That's when she met Nicholas Godejohn, a guy who was about as stable as a Jenga tower in an earthquake. They hit it off, and Gypsy spilled everything about her life. Nick's solution: death for Dee Dee. After the murder, Gypsy and Nick posted weird, taunting updates on Facebook. Definitely not how you fly under the radar. Cops found Dee Dee's body soon after, and the internet exploded with the truth about their toxic, insane relationship. Gypsy eventually got sentenced to 10 years in prison, which, compared to her life with Dee Dee, probably felt like summer camp. Nick got life without parole because, well, he did the stabbing. And then all of a sudden, the video just ends like this. See y'all.